There's something that I've learned from listening to literally thousands of albums from thousands of different bands is that there is a maturation process to being a music listener. The things that you liked whenever you first heard them or whenever you first got into listening to music, you know, in a big way, they're not necessarily the same as today, and they won't be necessarily the same thing as 10 years from now. That maturation project is very similar to the bands themselves, who perhaps whenever they first got started were very overindulgent, either that or tried to keep it very safe and confined. They are not the same group that they were whenever they first began. So there are a lot of bands that whenever I first listened to their material, I disliked it, and that was kind of where things ended. There was never ever a moment that ever sort of changed, or you know, my opinion of them harbored enough of a huge spike or decline that really shifted. But there are a couple groups that I initially disliked and grew to either really love or at least, you know, at the very least respect them. And I kind of want to tell you about a couple of those just as a fun little list. Don't take this too seriously. I just sort of want to share a couple of groups that at one point in time you might be surprised to know I didn't like very much, although a couple of them won't be very surprising to you at all. For example, you guys all know that I didn't really like Slipknot very much in 2009. Whenever we first started the channel, I was very, very harsh on this band for various different reasons. Now, strangely enough, this was sort of like a reverse roller coaster. It was odd, because whenever the band first came out, I thought that they were okay. In fact, even boldly predicted to a friend of mine in a letter back in the late 90s that they were probably going to be the next big thing. And that was just through the song Wait and Bleed, without even hearing anything from the debut album, without hearing anything from Iowa, etc., etc. I saw them live and did not have a good experience, and really everything that I heard sort of forthwith after that was not something that was, it wasn't all that impressive to me. It was just something that seemed like it was existing as part of a greater scene, and the scene itself was starting to get very tiresome. And whenever you have an environment where it seems like that's what everybody is all about, is that scene that is getting tiresome, man, sometimes it really sucks to know that some things are coming before they actually arrive, because by the time they actually arrive, you're sick of them. But this was a band that I just didn't really ever sort of click with at all. I still don't totally click with them. However, going through their discography, with the discography review that was done on this channel a couple of years ago, was definitely one that certainly caused a lot more respect to be there. And I do have respect for Slipknot. I do have respect for Corey Taylor and those guys, because what they have done and sort of the empire that they have built is pretty impressive, you have to admit. Even though you might make the joke that there's 9 of them, so it should be, you know, very likely they have enough damn people, or whatever the joke might be. It's definitely not easy to maintain yourself, and to have a couple of albums really pop with bands is certainly tremendous. Kind of like Avenged Sevenfold. That's another good band to sort of use as an example. This one is, again, sort of a roller coaster ride, because whenever I first heard them, it was the album Sounding of the Seventh Trumpet, and it was right around the same time as metalcore was starting to heat up, and so they didn't really stick out. They didn't pop very much. So initially, there was not many thoughts, at least in my mind, given toward this band, and then so whenever I heard tracks off of City of Evil, such as The Beast and the Harlot, it was like, whoa, who the hell is this band? You know, it sounds like a very different group than what I had just heard a couple of years before that. Now, whenever it came to my dislike and distaste of this band, it was not just because they initially seemed a bit generic. It was mostly because of whenever they blew up, and it had a lot to do with the folks that I was around, and a lot to do with the fact that there's just, it was everywhere. It was everywhere in my world. You know how some people say that whenever there's bullying in this, you know, millennium or this decade or whatever, you never get a chance to escape it because it happens at school, and then you go home on social media and it happens at home, you go outside, it happens there, and that's kind of how I felt with Avenged Sevenfold. I was bullied by Avenged Sevenfold fans. So, you know, it was something where it was constant. You know, you go into your car and it's there on the radio. I dated somebody who was a huge Avenged Sevenfold fan, so of course, what did she want to listen to on most occasions? Avenged Sevenfold, of course. You know, you go over people's houses and you hear Avenged Sevenfold. Avenged Sevenfold's on Guitar Hero. It's just something where it was everywhere, and it was tiresome. Man, oh man, it just got to be way too much. And so I like the fact that whenever, sort of like with Slipknot, whenever the discography review was done for this band, and that just happened a couple years ago once again, it was done whenever I was on sort of like a base neutral, you know, I no longer had that person in my life, I no longer had that sort of feeling where it was everywhere in my life, I had the opportunity to sit down and just enjoy it again, and I grew once again to respect the group. I wouldn't necessarily say that I love them. However, after listening to The Stage, I have to say that I love that album. I think that the direction that they're going in, being very sort of explorative, is very much in their favor, considering it makes their music a lot more interesting to listen to. It doesn't feel like it's sort of tempers the main line like their self-titled album did. And now, for example, where experimenting is not always a good thing is Napalm Death. Yeah, Napalm Death, Forefathers of Grind. I didn't like them at first. I was listening to Diatribes. It was the first album that I got from them. It was like $2 whenever I picked it up. And I thought, you know, how can you go wrong? Well, it was the wrong album to start with these guys, absolutely. This is, of course, back in the time before internet, so you couldn't just look things up and, you know, immediately get a great, sense of what a band was all about. This is an album that was from their experimental period in the 1990s, and it's one that I like a lot more today than I did whenever I first listened to it. It's kind of like listening to Demlick's album for the very first time, and hearing those vocals where it sounds like he's both puking and burping at the same time. You're like, wow, people actually like this shit, but then you keep going back, and you keep going back, and you keep going back to it, because you're just like, did I really hear that? Is that really kind of what happened? So eventually, I just gave Napalm Death a second chance. So it didn't really last very long, but I gave them another chance. I got some of their older releases, just really, really loved what I heard. And the funny thing is that over time, the more I revisited Diatribes, the more I really ended up liking the album. I like the raw sound, and I have a buddy from Texas. He and I have jokes about Mark Barney Greenway. It's just... the rest is kind of history, you know. Sometimes the first impression that you get isn't always the best, but it doesn't mean that that band is necessarily dead in your mind. It can still be a band that you end up really enjoying. Cradle of Filth. Obviously, I got over that. Yeah, I didn't receive this shirt for free or anything like that. I actually went out and purchased this. But the first time I heard Cradle of Filth, I was like, no, absolutely not. This is ridiculous. This is absurd. I recognized the talent that Danny Filth possessed. I recognized the talent that the band possessed, but I also got into this band or heard them whenever I was very early in my metal journey and had not yet taken that leap into extreme metal outside of thrash metal, a very small, minute part of death metal, and I was listening, of course, to a lot of progressive music as well. This was, I think, actually right around the same time I got into Opeth, so it was whatever. That really doesn't matter. But what was kind of odd about this is that it was sort of a here today, gone tomorrow notion. It's one of my buddies, the same buddy that I listened to Avenged Sevenfold with, we ended up mutually going all in on getting the, there was a greatest hits album or like some sort of hits album of Cradle of Filth from the first part of their career, like right around the time whenever Midian was coming out, I think, was the album where Bittersweet's the Sucky Baby. And so we sort of went all in, scoped this out, and the more that we listen to this album, the more that you're kind of transfixed by it. You know, Cradle is kind of a great example of not a first impression of an album sort of painting a bad picture, but the first impression of a song. And it's also why I kind of understand those who use Danny Filth's voice initially as a reason why they just absolutely dislike the band. You know, like we talked about in the 5 Reasons video that we just did a couple days ago. I get that, because I was there. I was one of those for like a hot minute, and it was really odd and it felt really stupid to judge something like that, but you sometimes are affected by something that's simple. It's like listening to Silencer for the first time and realizing, okay, this may not be for me ever. This is certainly something that's only for a select few. You understand why some bands only sell, 100 copies of their album, and it isn't necessarily because the music's bad. It sometimes isn't even necessarily because the vocals are bad. Some things are just a cup of tea that is for a specific breed, as opposed to being a cup of tea for you or for me. And then, DragonForce. DragonForce, really. I mean, funny thing is that I really didn't know much about this band. And then Guitar Hero happened, and then I was like, maybe I should find out some things about this band. But at that point, it was too late. That was kind of the bad thing. All of a sudden, everybody was a DragonForce expert. And you should say to yourself, well, who cares? They're DragonForce experts. You're not. You're learning about the band. What the fuck ever. But it was DragonForce. It was a band. I was a metalhead. I should have known about this. And then whenever I heard it, I thought to myself, wow, that's pretty crazy. Then I saw them live and was like, wow, that's not the craziness that, what? So yeah, some of the anger that I showed whenever we did DragonForce as one of the bands of the 10 worst artists blah 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 a number of years back, some of that was 100% just for the yucks and the chucks. You know, that was certainly half-hearted. It wasn't meant to be this super serious thing. But there were a couple of criticisms in there that were based around some actual experiences that I had. You know, the quick line that said that they can't play their stuff live. At that point, they couldn't. However, from what I've heard over the course of the past number of years is that the quality of their live shows has significantly improved. Not to mention their material is fantastic. This is one of the groups where instead of it just being a respect thing, I've grown to love DragonForce and enjoy listening to them on various occasions. I haven't really reviewed them very much, mostly because I'm sort of afraid of two things. One, I wouldn't have very much to say, considering all you have to say is, holy crap, spellbinding guitar solo, and DragonForce immediately comes to mind. And two, of course, the scrutiny that could potentially be handled, considering I'd shat all over them just a couple years prior to a video that was more about satire than anything else. Either way, DragonForce is a pretty terrific band. It's a group that a lot of folks will negate getting into simply because it'll just feel like another cheesy power metal group. Either that or Guitar Hero has, broke their spirit so poorly that they can listen to none of the artists on there any longer. So, enjoy listening to Muse, cocksuckers, that they just don't give DragonForce a chance anymore. But I did. I really like the band. I think they're really great. I'm sure that there's a lot of other examples that I could come up with if I sat down and thought about it, but I don't want to give us that much thought. Don't be afraid to give something a second chance. That's the only thing that I'll say. Sometimes it will be just as bad as you remember it from the first time, but sometimes you'll end up really leaning in a different direction. And sometimes your environment is just as damning as the music itself whenever it comes to whether or not you really like something. So keep all that in mind. If you like this video, obviously hit the like button. If you like these bands and you don't have some of their albums, pick them up on the Amazon store, I guess. I don't know how to really end this video, so I'll just say that I'm CoverKillerNation. Thanks for being here with me today, and I'll see you next time.